Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
We have Robin, Howard, Jeffrey, Alan, Jack, Frank, Aaron, Craig, Bill, Michael, Neil, Georgie, and Robert, Kevin, Patrick, Dinyar, Brandon, Marty, Andrew, thank you, Martin. Oh, now, Tom, Michael,
Snake,
Douglas,
Don.
Thank you.
Now go down again and see what they say next time.
Okay, we have our guest speaker today. Some of you know Roger Corless before, and for the new people who knew here doesn't know Roger yet. Roger taught Buddhism at a Duke University for 29 years. He's in terminal sabbatical.
That's true.
And Roger will be teach at the Great Electromagnetic Chang'an University in Honolulu in fall. Correct?
Chaminade.
Chang'an
Yes.
University in Honolulu in fall. Meantime, Roger's in San Francisco. And here we have Roger.
Okay. Well, since we have some incense, if you indulge me.
Okay.
There's only one of the two Buddhists, of course. Of the kind of nod. Well, okay, that seems better. So you want me to stop about 11:45, do you?
Yes.
And then for questions? All right. Well, I'm Roger Corless, and I'm a homeless wanderer with 2 suitcases and a bank account. So I don't know where I live at the moment. I was asked where did I live and where was my family, and I said, well, mother and father are dead. I don't have any brothers or sisters. There's a rumor of a relative in New Zealand, and there's the blind sister of my father in a nursing home in Liverpool, looked after by her family. I've sold the house and the car. My books, which is the most important thing, are in the store, and I have 2 suitcases. So I was asked to talk, but I wasn't told what to talk about. Nobody came up with a topic. So I thought I would talk on open up the question of who is the Buddha, or what is a Buddha. It's obviously very central to the Buddhist tradition to ask this question, and there's enough in an answer to take up a whole course. In the Buddhist sutras, when the Buddha is asked to give a sermon, especially in the Mahayana sutras, he tends to speak for a few centuries. But we have to break for lunch, so we won't go on quite that long. And all I can do, I think, is open up the question, and if we want to go into it at another time when I'm back in the Bay Area, if I ever am. I don't know. I'm going, as you heard, I'm going to be teaching in Honolulu during the fall, of course, in Buddhist-Christian dialogue, which is my chief interest. And I may be so attracted by the connections I make there in that area that I may decide to settle there. Certainly the prices of houses are much less, though the price of soap and such things is much more, so it may balance off. So I may never come back to the Bay Area. On the other hand, I may decide to live here or commute, as people seem to do. So I'm just going to open up this topic. The first thing I would want to emphasize, and this would be the theme. If you only get this, I think it will do. There is no textual or traditional evidence whatsoever for regarding the Buddha as merely a human being. I'll say it again. There is no textual or traditional doctrinal evidence whatsoever for regarding the Buddha as merely a human being. In this enlightened age, as we use it in a different sense of enlightened, we have difficulty, I think, with the notion of anybody who is really much more knowledgeable or much more advanced than ourselves. Actually, this is part of the problem of professors who tend to make you think that if you have a PhD in something, you've reached the top of the line. But from a Buddhist perspective, having obtained a PhD is an indication of having worked with a confused mind somewhat longer than most other beings. So it is not really an indication of any advance. In brief, in the Theravada tradition, the Buddha is regarded as one who knows everything that needs to be known, and in the Mahayana tradition, the Buddha is regarded as one who knows absolutely everything. In both traditions, the Buddha is regarded as unconditioned, that is to say, not constrained by the fruiting of karma after he reaches to his enlightenment, and able to, and therefore not constrained to be reborn. And since our definition of a human is one who, after death, is then forced to be reborn, the Buddha cannot be called a human. There is indeed a rather a grim little incident in one of the early Mahayana sutras, where the Buddha meets up with his former 5 disciples who've left him, and they call him by his human name, and they say, "Good Gautama, you seem to be different. Have you changed?" And he says, "I am a Buddha. Do not call me the good Gautama, or Gautama, my human name, lest you be reborn in the hells for a long time." So, if you think the Buddha is only a human, you see that you're very naughty and very nasty things will happen to you. In fact, the idea is that the Buddha impressed people as being somebody who impressed the disciples that he got. Somebody who really knew something very different and had somehow penetrated to the nature of reality. And his penetration to the nature of reality is rather curious and perhaps rather disappointing, because after having penetrated the nature of reality, he doesn't come up with a long metaphysical sermon. He says everything is suffering. Way I sometimes like to answer them at restaurants. You get your meal, and after a bit the wait person comes by and says, "So how is everything?" "Everything is suffering," I say, "but the food's okay." Then also what the Buddha then proclaimed, which is called in Sanskrit the Dharma, or in Pali Dhamma, which is a word of extremely rich, diverse meanings, but something like the truth, the way reality is, or something like that, is then identified with a hymn. And in the Pali Suttas, the Buddha says, "One who sees me sees the Dhamma, and one who sees the Dhamma sees me." And that indicates that the Buddha is proclaiming the way reality is by what he is, by what he does. And it's not simply by his speaking. In Buddhism, we conventionally distinguish between acts of body, speech, and mind. It could be almost anything else. It's just a conventional thing to say all our actions of body, speech, and mind. So we all have acts of body, speech, and of mind. If we are identified as teachers, as professors often, mistakenly very often are, then the teaching is normally identified with the speech, what we say, or maybe our bibliography. A professor is normally only as good as their bibliography, I would say. So it's identified with speech, and then the rest of the person's life is not investigated. So you would not expect to be taught, if you go to a university, by the way the professor would walk or eat his or her lunch. And you would also not necessarily think that the mind of the professor was in total accord with what they were saying and doing. In Buddhism, that is expected, that the teacher should be, or should be striving to be, a teaching in all their acts of body, speech, and mind. And some people have actually noted that when they have been in the presence of some of the higher teachers, especially the Tibetan tradition, where this is emphasized a little bit more than other traditions, just to serve them a meal was an enlightening, a calming, and a joyful experience. Something was different about the way the guy ate his meat, and Tibetans eat meat. There's no doubt about that. Meat. Oh, how can they eat meat? Well, they do. Just by that. And I don't think this is confined to the Buddhist tradition. There is a story from the Hasidic tradition about the boy who goes away to study with a Rebbe, and after many years comes back, and they say, "Well, now, what did you learn?" And they expect a long story, and he says, "I saw the Rebbe tie his shoes." And if you can tie your shoes very well, that's it, that's the teaching. If you can do ordinary things, as this saying in the Christian tradition, a saint is not one who does extraordinary things, but one who does ordinary things extraordinarily well. So then the Buddha and the Dhamma or the Dharma are in some way identified from the earliest tradition that we know. The third refuge, the third aspect of the triple jewel, as those of you who are familiar with Buddhism know very well, is the Sangha, or the community. When the Buddha was according to the Pali tradition, about to pass away from the phenomenal world, whether he really did or not is something we'll come to in a moment. He is reported to have said in the final sutta, Mahaparinibbana Suttanta, they began to weep and lament and wail and say, "You're leaving us." And actually, it was all the fault of Ananda. The disciple Ananda was apparently very devoted to the Buddha. He was constantly in attendance to him and so forth. He was extremely, he was very devoted, but he was a bit dumb. And so the record is that the Buddha had said to him, if the Bhagavan is asked, he can remain until the end of the age. And Ananda says, "Oh yes." And 3 times the Buddha said, if the Bhagavan is asked, he can be remaining until the end of the age, isn't it? And Ananda says, "Oh yes." And then when he's about to die, they say, "Oh no." And he says, "Well, I gave you the chance to ask me to stay for the end of the age, but you didn't. So you blew it, so I'm going." Oh. So, and then he said, well, they said, who can we rely on now? Who is our refuge? The refuges, as those of you who know Buddhism well are things that we recite often at the beginning of any service, and they are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, which are regarded as the true refuges, the refuges from the... we all take refuge in something. Refuge in, perhaps a new BMW or a new lover or something, and this is going to fix us. We're going to be fine after that's all over. But it doesn't work out. Something goes wrong. But the true refuges are those that do actually lead to liberation from suffering. And they said, so now that you're leaving, in whom can we take refuge? And he said, you can take the Dhamma as your light, and as your island. Actually, using the word Deepa, which can mean an island and a light. Dhamma Deepa can mean the Dhamma is an island, a refuge, or it is a light. And take yourselves as a refuge. Now, this is very often misunderstood by kind of what I call muscular Buddhists, who say Buddhism is about you do it yourself, you get to enlightenment by yourself, and you just sit and you do it. It's very important to note that it's in the plural. It doesn't say you take yourself for refuge, but take yourselves for refuge, which means the Sangha. He has transmitted the Dhamma to the Sangha to be kept in trust by the Sangha. So it then is not unexpected that sometime later in a post-canonical text called the Milinda Panya, the questions to King Milinda. This is a text done after the Hellenization of the northeast of the Indian subcontinent, when there were rulers there who were extremely influenced by Greek thought, and the question to King Milinda is in the form of a Socratic dialogue, where, as you know, there's the smart guy and the dumb guy, and the dumb guy says, "Oh, so what about this, huh?" And then the smart guy says so and so, and the guy, "Oh yeah, okay, that's sure." So he figures it out. So you always know who's going to win. And in this, it's the King Milinda who is the dumb guy and is asking all the questions, and the monk Nagasena, army of snakes, who is the one who's giving the answers. And in this case, without going through all of the dialogue that leads up to this, the point of it at the end of the story is the king says, "Can the Buddha be pointed out as being here or there?" This is many years after the disappearance of the Buddha. And he says, no, the Buddha cannot be pointed out as being here or there. He's passed into final nibbana, final cooling down or quieting. It's a difficult word to translate that. I think the best way is to say, no, he's gone out. The analogy being of a fire that has gone out, and you can't say which way did the fire go when it went out. It just goes out. So the Buddha goes out, and therefore is not available to be pointed out as being here or there. You can't say after the fire has gone out, where did it go? And then the king says, well, then you can't get any teaching. What's going to happen? And he says, but still, Nagasena says, the Buddha can be pointed out, Dhammakayena Sangha cha. So, by means of the body of the teaching, the Dhammakaya, and by means of the corpus or institution of the Sangha, the community, so that the theory is, if you meet the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns and educated lay people who have learnt the Dhamma, then you are as if you are in the presence of the Buddha right now, even though he has passed into final Nibbana. Now, so even there, we can say that there's a sense in which the Buddha is around still. Now, sometime later, some of the Buddhists had some problems with this, and they said, we have heard it said that the Buddha passed into final Nibbana, and that means that he's no longer able to be pointed out as being here or there in himself. And doesn't that mean that that he's kind of left us in the lurch in some way? I mean, he's left us with the Dhamma and the Sangha, but shouldn't he be around? How is it that he's gone to liberation and left all of us? Now, first of all, we should note very closely that he passes into final Nibbana, and I said I've had difficulty translating this because there really isn't a straightforward way. Going into the etymology of it and saying it means to go out or to be cool or something doesn't really help that much. It never means extinguished in the sense of going into nothingness. It never means going into non-being. When the Buddha was asked in the Pali Suttas various metaphysical questions, one of which is, where does the Arhat or realized person go after death? That is to say, after liberation, after final Nibbana, does the liberated person go into nothingness, that's the end, extinguished, there's nothing left? Or do they go to some other realm and endure in some subtle way? Or does part of them get extinguished and part of them not get extinguished? Or is it something else? To all of those he said, no, it's not right. It doesn't apply. There's something else. And he would not say what happened. In the Pali Suttas he doesn't say what happens. But at least by not answering that, we know for sure that there is, from the earliest tradition, there is not any support for the notion that Nibbana is extinction into nothingness. But it is also not endurance in some kind of heaven where they're playing harps all the time or something. If you like harp music, I guess the Christian tradition would be okay, but they're playing the harps again. So So then these Buddhists thought, well, if he passes into Nibbana and leaves us, although he's left us with the Dhamma and the Sangha, isn't it slightly selfish? I mean, and how could a Buddha be selfish? So as this was happening, apparently also, and this is controversial at the moment, because it gets into the whole question of how did the Mahayana, the tradition of Buddhism in North and East Asia, come to be? And this is still debated by professors. You know what that means. We go round and round and seem to get nowhere. But it's still being debated and being investigated. And something is coming clearer now than it was, but it's still not very clear. But it appears that some people were in their meditation were having very powerful visions of the Buddha still existing and existing in some glorious kind of realm. And this didn't make any sense, because he was supposed to have gone from the phenomenal world. But eventually they decided that actually there was a kind of position, there was a kind of place that wasn't a place, and it was a different, and the nirvana, where you disappeared from the phenomenal world, was a false nirvana, or a false understanding of nirvana, and that the true nirvana was what was called a pratishtita nirvana, the unstuck nirvana or unsupported nirvana, that was neither in nirvana nor in samsara. I would call it unconditioned, completely unconditioned, or non-referential. So they were getting out from they were trying not to fall into the problem of identifying nirvana as a place, but also not as sort of nothing at all. They were trying, in fact, to answer the question that, as far as we know, the Buddha himself did not answer. The great exponent of this is a text called the Lotus Sutra, which is a fairly short sutra by the Mahayana standards, but it's about this thick in English, so it's fairly substantial. Although a whole lot of it seems to get nowhere. If you've read the Lotus Sutra, it keeps on saying, this is a wonderful teaching, it's great, really, you must read and I never know what it says. It never seems to say what it is. It's there. If you go to the commentaries and fiddle with it, you can find out what is there, but it's not clear on the surface. But one of the features of it is that Buddha Shakyamuni reveals that there never has been a time when he wasn't enlightened. And he says, in order to help living beings, I went through the motions of being born and growing up and searching for enlightenment and getting married, leaving my family, going to the wilderness, apparently being enlightened, then teaching, then passing into nirvana. And this was for the weaker people. The weaker people by this time have left, because at the beginning of the Lotus Sutra the Buddha says, I'm going to reveal the real truth now, and all the people, 1/3 of the people there said, well, we already know that, and they get up and left. And those are called the Shravakas or Hinayanis, which are the dumb, proud people. And the Buddha says, excellent, excellent, my congregation is purified of dross. So he wasn't too sad to see them go. So they're awfully mean to the Shravakas in the Mahayana sutras. If you meet a Mahayanist who calls you a Shravaka, it's an insult. I mean, it's not good. Then there is explicitly said in the whole chapter in Lotus Sutra, a chapter on the length of life of the Buddha. And the length of the life of the Buddha is said to be, and they always read the text in Chinese. I mean, there is a Sanskrit version of the Lotus Sutra, but nobody reads it. It's all in East Asia. It's all read in the Kumarajiva translation from into the Chinese. And the length of life is said to be Wuliang, Liang is a measure, which means something that it's really sort of a measure. You put things in. It's a kind of vessel. And Wu means is the negative, without. So without a measure or immeasurable. And what it seems to mean is not that it's very long, but that it's intrinsically immeasurable, that it's non-referential, that it doesn't have you can't ever put a beginning and an ending, and you can't talk in those terms of beginning and ending. So that in some sense, apparently, although in some sense there is a Buddha who goes through the life cycle, in some sense the Buddha never does that. And the Lotus Sutra kind of leaves you with this puzzle, and it never really goes and explains, because it's one of the earlier Mahayana sutras, and apparently they were still working out what it all might have meant. As things go on, to fast forward a number of hundred years, eventually the Mahayana teaches that the Buddha has three forms, which really are two forms. It's simply two forms and it becomes three. The two forms are the invisible form, the form without any, the formless form, with no qualities, called the Dharmakaya. Now, does this ring a bell that we talked first in the just a bit ago I talked of in the Pali tradition, they say the Buddha is to be seen in his Dhammakaya, in the body of the teaching, where Dhamma means the teaching. A dharma can also mean more than that, as I said. It can also mean reality itself. So now there's a notion that somehow at the basis of all of reality is the Buddha nature in some sense or another. They have to be very careful when they say this not to sound like a Hindu, because it's even worse for Buddhists to call you a Hindu than to call you a Shravaka. But it's not an essence, but it's there. It's something that is identifiably there without being an essence. So the formless form is the Dharmakaya, which is reality as it is, or the pure mind. And then there is the Rupakaya, or the Buddha with form, which is the one we can say something about. And then the Rupakaya, the form body, is then divided into two, normally, the Sambhogakaya, which is the huge one as large as the cosmic mountain and full of the marks and signs and putting out glorious light and so forth, which is the one that's used for teaching deities, because deities wouldn't be impressed by humans, because they kind of stink like animals and they wouldn't listen to us. But this is sufficient to get the deity's attention. And then there's the human form, because we would be totally blown away by the big Buddha form. So the human form, the Nirmanakaya, which then in some traditions, the Tibetan and Mongolian tradition, is identified with individuals, such as the Dalai Lama is identified as being a Nirmanakaya of a Bodhisattva. And it's just a human, so he has, it is human looks to be a human, that he's born and he gets sick and he dies. But in some kind of essence, he's not a human, you see. Whatever that means. Whenever he's asked this, he very cleverly changes the subject to something else, so that he leaves it up to you to decide if he's really a Nirmanakaya, an incarnation. So then the idea is that the Dharmakaya somehow is manifesting itself as the Rupakaya, and it's often explained that this is because of its compassionate aspect. The wisdom aspect is reality as it is. The compassion aspect is as it moves towards us. And a sort of odd little text that no one knows where it came from, supposed to be written by Ashvaghosha, but clearly it isn't, only exists in the Chinese, called the Treatise on the Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, the Da Chang Chi Sin Lun. It says the Dharmakaya, or Dharmadhatu, it calls it there, mysteriously moves towards us and perfumes our reality. And we kind of smell this perfume, like on clothes, you smell perfume on clothes, so you think of the person who put the perfume on or something. And therefore we're attracted to this. The idea is to try to solve the question: if we are totally in suffering and an unenlightened mind, how can we possibly know about enlightenment? Because there's no place that we don't have unenlightenment, and there's a big gap. So the teaching is that there's actually a kind of smell, a perfume. Something happens that doesn't really cause anything, but we get a indication of it, and so then we strive towards that, as it is also striving towards us. And so the teaching of the triple body, which is that becomes a triple body, as you can see, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Rupakaya, is that the Buddha is moving towards us, and we are kind of being attracted and moving towards the Buddha. And this leads to a variety of practices, especially emphasized in the Vajrayana and in the Pure Land, where there is a kind of linking or synergy between our practice and the practice of the Buddha. Rather than we just sit here and decide, I'm going to get to enlightenment before next Thursday, which would then be an isolationist view of things. And in a sense also then, because the Dharmakaya is moving towards us, we're moving towards the Dharmakaya, and the Dharmakaya is what everything is, in some sense we are also Buddhas, and we are realizing who we are. Now obviously there's a great deal more to be said on this, and this was actually the question, who or what is the Buddha, is the question I would ask the students in my introductory course in Buddhism at Duke University, and they very seldom got it right because it is so complicated. So if you don't get it all right, that's okay, but maybe that's an introduction that will be helpful, and we've got a few minutes for we can answer questions, or I can try to answer some questions. Yes, none.
If I understood what you said, I shouldn't put it like that. You said something about the Sangha holds the truth. What kind of truth do we hold? Are we a Sangha? And what kind of truth do we hold? What is Sangha?
The word Sangha really just means a flock or community, and also Gana is good. That's all, another word of use for it, not so often. And it really referred to any collection of people who were attached, who went with the Buddha as he went around, which is what happens to all spiritual teachers in India, and also to all tourists. You go to India and you are having people all around you. You have the flock that goes with you to help you. So it can be given a very vague appellation like that, or it can be specifically focused on the persons who have taken vows, especially taken vows in the monastic tradition of monks or nuns. I think it needs to be put in context of the Dharma, that if the Sangha is just clustering around a Buddha, well, first of all, you have to have a Buddha or a teacher, I think, of some sort, and you're clustering around that, and then you're learning the Dharma. So just to be a cluster might not be an inheritor of the Dharma. I think this is why in the Buddhist tradition there's a fair amount of emphasis on, if you are authorized as a teacher, who authorized you? And are you teaching the right thing, or are you teaching something that is not the right thing? So the word Sangha has many meanings, I think. So. I might do what one Tibetan teacher would say, do you have a question? And if you don't, says, well, I'll ask you a question then. Does this teaching of the triple body of the Buddha make any difference to how you would do your practice? Anyone like to respond to that? Yes. Pardon? No. Why not?
To make any difference? What kind of difference would you expect it would make?
I wouldn't expect anything, but it certainly is a very important teaching about the nature of Buddhism and the Buddha. So I wouldn't expect any particular thing, but I would expect that if you hadn't heard of this before or hadn't thought of it before, that it would make a difference. Maybe somebody else might have a thought. Yes.
Well, I would argue that actually doesn't make sense because I think what attracts Americans to Buddhism is the idea that Buddha actually was a human being. And I think that's why a lot of people have left Christianity or don't practice it as intensely. And a lot of the way Buddhism is received in this country is, in fact, what we like about Buddhism is that he was a human being and he got to the core of reality on his own. And if what you say is true, then it would seem to me that, in line with the Mahayana perspective, that you can't do it on your own. It will make a big difference because it will mean that all your breathing and posture and yoga exercises would at some point not make much of a difference. If you didn't reach out to something beyond yourself, power with you, other power.
I think that there is the problem in what I would call Caucasian American Buddhism, because it tends to be largely Caucasian, as we see looking around the room here, that it is attractive to people who are the sort of American who wants to do things on their own. They want to be. They don't want anyone to give them orders or to tell them what to do. And the question of interconnection, of interdependent arising, which is fundamental to Buddhism, which teaches that we don't do anything on our own. There isn't any us to do on our own, actually. That is somehow missed. And maybe because some of us have been misled as to the nature of the ego, we may have been told to destroy the ego, whereas, and we say, no one's going to destroy me, whereas in Buddhism we learn there isn't this ego that we think to be destroyed at all. So it's like holding grimly onto something and saying, you're not going to see what I've got this very precious thing, you're not ever going to see this. And then we prise open the hand, there's nothing there. So there's no problem. You had your hand up too, I think.
It seems it's kind of like an inspirational teaching, because especially the idea that Buddha is sort of perfuming constantly through your reality. Like a lot of times you hear about, like when you're watching a sunset or, all these kind of joyful experiences that very ordinary people, that everybody has in their life, can be somehow very profound experiences. And what are those experiences, and what are what's going on at that time? Maybe that could be the sparkling through or the perfume of the Buddha nature.
There is an incident in the sutra on the teaching of Vimalakirti, where the Buddha says to Shariputra, is it Ananda? I think it's Shariputra, and says, don't you see how all the universe is filled with Buddhas teaching on lotus thrones all around us, and all the stars and so forth? And he says, So the Buddha taps his foot, and suddenly everything changes, and he sees all of these Buddhas as Buddhas are not stars, and they're all teaching, and the whole universe is marvelous. And then he taps his foot again, and all goes back to normal. And then the sutra, that same sutra also says, as a Buddha's mind is pure, so is his land pure. And the idea seems to be related to the Yogacara teaching, that we live in a suffering reality because in some sense we have made that up. And we don't know how to stop making up the suffering reality, and we think that it comes to us, that it's just the way reality is, and nothing we can do about it. And then something happens to show us we can change that. And maybe like a sunset or something, where we begin to see this is not just suffering, but it is also nirvana. It is the diamond realm, the vajradhatu. And we don't go to somewhere else, we just change our focus, our consciousness, and this then arises as the Buddha realm. Snake, I think you had your hand up.
I just don't see how you could do anything but accept both of those views. I mean, they're both helpful, and so and the reason it seems confusing is because there's concepts, and but there's a leap of faith, and there's a grace. I think that's what I was going to say about if you see the Buddha as non-human, you can take that as an act of grace, something that the ego can't do, if it ever on its own to receive enlightenment. But then you can say the Sangha is concretized grace too. So,
well, it's not simply that. I think this is something that maybe upsets people sometimes. It's not simply that the Buddha is unconditioned and we are not. If the Buddha was only a human, then he would not have been able to penetrate to the nature of reality and express it in his body, speech, and mind. There is then a difference between Buddhism and the theistic systems, in that there is, at least at that level, a dualism between God and the world. This dualism is eventually destroyed by various doctrines which are quite important, and I won't go into now, but it starts off as the dualism, just as it starts off in Theravada, between the Buddha and Nibbana is there and we are here. But then we, in Theravada, we develop into Buddhas. And in the Mahayana, we're already Buddhas and we don't realize it. So it's not that, the Buddha's okay and I'm not okay, I'm a worm and a miserable thing. But I am actually a Buddha. Why don't I realize that? You see? And by seeing the Buddha having finished all of this and doing all this great stuff, I think, that's what I am. And if I can work or see it right or whatever, I will be like that too. So it's a teaching actually of our inner nobility and of the possibility that we're not stuck in our suffering.
for some reason I don't see how that's different from other theistic religions or other religions. I don't see the difference there.
Well, now then, I'm not sure what it is that you're seeing as the same, because to me it seems very different. But the Buddha is in no sense a God who creates the world. The Buddha or the Buddhas are manifestations of the way reality is that we can eventually also see. And there may be resonances with this. In the Christian tradition, we're not just actually worms, we are actually sons and daughters of God by adoption, as Jesus is Son of God by nature. So, I mean, there's lots of resonances there. I don't want to convert this into my course in Buddhist Christian dialogue, which I'll be teaching in Honolulu. Come over to Honolulu and hear all of that. But there are curious kind of resonances there. It is not the same, because the Buddha is not a God in any sense. The Buddha is, in fact, is the teacher of gods and humans. So is called also the God beyond gods. So I don't know whether that's the. Are you seeing something there that's just perhaps
I guess
like a resonance?
I guess I just see the difference to me is one is referential and one is non-referential.
Yeah.
But I see them as the same.
Yeah.
Because it's just that one we're always referring to as being separate, but there is a lot of teaching about the God within you. That God is within each of us.
Yes, but you see, that's not the Buddha in you. If you have the Trinity, the indwelling Trinity in the Christian tradition has nothing to do with the Buddha. It's just structurally the same. But the, God in Trinity makes the world. The Buddha doesn't make anything. Will that do now? We're a little bit over time, so yes. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. So wait. So we have to distribute all the merits. Oh, you do? Okay. I would distribute them. I'd distribute the merit after the talk, but nevertheless, if we wanted announcements first.
Okay.
I was just going to finish with the formula.
Okay.
All right. May all beings be separated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings be joined to happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings dwell in equanimity with those who are near and those who are far. May all beings attain to peace, joy, and freedom.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.